in relation to enlightenment was the response that many monarchs or monarchies had to the new ideas that started to spread across Europe, and that somehow started to question not only the Ancien Regime, the social, economic, and political situation, but the monarchy itself. So with this idea of if you can find them, join them, probably the monarchs of that moment, that and somehow they wanted to be patrons and to somehow be surrounded by the enlightened thinkers, decided to incorporate some aspects of the innovations, the new ideas of the Enlightenment, but in a way that somehow by absorbing them wouldn't completely change the system. This is what we call the enlightened despotism, because the monarchs remain despots that rule just after their own will, but with this motto of everything for the people, nothing by the people. Todo para el pueblo, pero sin el pueblo. So they will give, make some changes, they would yield, no es como que iban a ceder en algunos aspectos, but trying to remain their power intact. The reality is that the ideas of the Enlightenment were so revolutionary in some aspects that the structural changes, the deep changes, were imminent, and the enlightened despots or monarchs just postponed something that sooner or later was going to occur. In relation to politics, they try to improve their managing systems by centralizing the governments. Something that had been occurring for the last centuries, but they just developed more centralized systems. And they introduced strong reforms in the national administration to make it more modern, more efficient, and that required a huge body of civil servants, un gran cuerpo de funcionarios del Estado, that will apply those principles of centralization. And so we can say that more or less the state started to look more like a state of our days, with like a lot of bureaucracy. As social measures, servitude was abolished from all Western Europe in the few places that remained, but not in Eastern Europe. So enlightened despots such as Catherine of Russia did not introduce this measure, but somehow all reduced the privileges of nobility. Again, the attempts of reducing the power of the nobility in Europe had been a constant across like throughout the modern history, and this continued in this moment. Very important for the Enlightenment were the economic ideas, and in this way the enlightened despots tried to introduce changes that somehow allow for an economic growth, and that to have like more income for taxes. So they develop new methods in agriculture that we explained on the previous video, the introduction of the industries, the royal factories, changes in trade and international trade, colonization of new lands, of territories on their own countries and on their colonies that were not inhabited or not economically exploited, and better irrigation systems were introduced, but basically not because they cared about the people, but because those economic changes will produce more benefits, and those benefits will allow for a bigger income from taxes. It is in this moment, during this period, when the national banks were created. The first national bank was the Bank of England, but later this model was going to be copied by all the enlightened despots. Education started to be demanded as something that people should receive, although in reality it's not going to be until the 20th century when in Europe really schools were common and scholarization became mandatory. But the idea of having schools for the population start to appear here, and in some countries more than others. They started to pass laws regarding this, and not only elementary schools but also creation of modern economies that were not, because the universities were associated with the church, but these new academies were like following the ideas of the Enlightenment and like scientific ideas, so they were more advanced. Also, for example, in some countries like in Spain, the royal academies were founded, ¿no? La Real Academia de la Lengua, la Real Academia de la Historia, yeah. And the religious tolerance, after so many years, of course, related with religion, was accepted, and laws about religious tolerance were passed, and also, and more importantly, limitations to the influence of the clergy and the papacy on society and on the states. So basically, again, the monarchs wanted to have more control over their population, and that meant having less control from the church. We have plenty of examples. In Spain, the most paramount example is Charles III. In Austria, we have Joseph and Marie Therese, Catherine of Russia, as I mentioned before, Friedrich II of Prussia, Joseph I of Portugal, and they love to have this image of enlightened despots, and they hired important enlightened thinkers for their administrations, or so they work for them and they introduce these changes that they wanted. But in reality, as we should understand, these changes were more cosmetic, superficial than in depth. So the problems of the Ancien society, of the Ancien Regime society, the problems of strongly polarized societies with privileges for a few and a lot of hard work and taxes for the majority of the population, with economies that were not very productive, and in general very unfair societies were starting to fall apart. Yes, so no changes that these absolute monarchs could undertake would have stopped the questioning from some elites, social elites of the situation, and then their attempt to change this situation in society. Okay, and the last part of this unit is the point 5 about this century in Spain. So if you remember from last year, we mentioned that after the death of Charles II, childless, a war broke out because there were two candidates. Charles II himself had designated as his heir to Philip of Bourbon, the grandson of the King of France. But everybody knew that this appointment had been under heavy pressures from France. Yes, so we can say that somehow this designation had not been completely free, apart from the fact that Charles II was a strongly disabled person that probably couldn't take decisions completely freely. And then on the other hand, we have another candidate that was Charles of Habsburg. So it was a member of the Habsburg dynasty from Austria. So we can say more or less a cousin of Charles II. But he had not been appointed. So it was just another candidate because of dynastical reasons. So the dispute had a great transcendence in Europe, because at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, France was the most important country in Europe that tried to take control of the international arena. And then the other powers of Europe feared that even Spain, as a French king started to rule, this will be too much, and this will strengthen a lot France's position, or even being neighbors, France and Spain could join and being like a superpower. So England, the Netherlands, Portugal, Prussia, and other countries decided to oppose the candidacy of Philip and support the candidacy of Charles of Austria, Charles of Habsburg. And then Castile, the kingdom of Charles II, France obviously, and Bavaria, that was part of what is now Germany, but that was an independent Catholic German state, decided to support Philip. One thing that I forgot, the Crown of Aragon in Spain, the Crown of Aragon, that remember that by the end of the 17th century, Aragon and Castile were separate states, but just ruled by the same monarch. So Aragon decided to support Charles of Austria because they feared an excessive centralization by the Bourbon candidate, because the French had a stronger tendency to centralize the administration. And Aragon didn't want that because they understood that they will be somehow assimilated to Castile, and they wanted to maintain their autonomy. So this is the situation. The war started in the year 1700, and had different scenarios, not only in Spain but also in other parts of Europe. And although the war was being mainly won by the Bourbon candidate, the fact that they decided to quit before it was completely the other side had completely surrendered. The treaty that put an end to the war, in reality, was ended up being quite negative for Spain, because the opponents, so Austria and England and the Netherlands, demanded certain things for accepting an end of the war before really ending the war, before they had surrendered. So they accepted that Philip of Bourbon ruled in Spain, but with some losses for Spain. That mainly, the great winner was England, that incorporated Gibraltar and the island of Menorca and the right to trade with the Spanish American colonies. And then Austria also gained some of the Italian territories that the crown of the Habsburgs in Spain had. He had the Duchy of Milan in the north and the Kingdom of Naples, Sardinia, and Sicily in the south. This loss of all these territories and the loss of not having the monopoly on trading with American colonies was going to be something that throughout the 18th century the Spanish Bourbon monarchs were going to try to take back, to recover. So the first Bourbon king was Philip II, and after him he ruled more or less all the first half of the 18th century. He died in 1546, if my memory doesn't fail. Then two of his sons ruled, first Fernando VI, and then Charles III, and then Charles IV. So they, as the Crown of Aragon had feared, they incorporated the French model of a centralized absolutism. So they took this measure to administrate all the territory of what we now call Spain, with the same under the same laws. Okay, this was different because until this moment, if you remember, the rule like Castile and Aragon had kept different laws in many aspects. So because Aragon had supported the Habsburg candidate, so they had lost, they were imposed these new laws taken from the laws of Castilla. Yeah, so these decrees, remember that a decree is a law issued directly by the head of a state, so a law directly published by the monarch in this case. So these decrees of Nueva Planta were passed, and they unified the laws and privileges of the Crown of Aragon that they had remained until that they had maintained until then. This is something that we can consider that is on the base of the Catalan nationalism. Yeah, because they say that at that moment is when they lost their independence, and they started to be under the rule of Castile or later Spain. Altogether with this, there were important economic reforms that were in great need, because the 17th century had been a century of serious crisis that tried to be fixed by all these new economic reforms. So they increased the agricultural production by colonizing new land and introducing channels of irrigation and systems of irrigation that allowed for a more productive agriculture that was transformed into a strong increase in the population. In 1 century, it went from 7 million people to 11, yes, so 4 million, almost double. It grew by 40%. The trade with the American colonies that until then had been monopolized by the ports of Seville and Cadiz was open to other ports of Spain, which then promoted more business from other territories with the colonies, which actually was quite positive. And also they eliminated the internal boundaries, the internal taxes that trade had between territories. Until that point, for example, trading between Castile and Aragon had a tax, had a tariff. So they eliminated those tariffs with the intention of stimulating free trade amongst the territory of the country. They stimulated also the industrial production. They created the royal manufactories, royal factories, las reales fábricas. And also the first modern factories appeared, mainly the textile factories in Catalonia, that actually started to appear, copying the English model. Also, but based on the profits made by Catalan traders, that when for the first time in the 18th century they were allowed to trade with the American continent, with the profit that they made there, they invested it on textile factories, copying the model of the English traders and merchants. That was going to be very profitable. Since Spain, so being Spain so strongly religious, and being the Catholic Church so influential in Spain, sadly the Enlightenment in Spain is not as splendorous as it was in other parts of Europe. The church controlled the advances in science and philosophy and stopped deep changes from occurring. But even with that, we see a great spread of these ideas amongst nobility, the bourgeoisie, the new type of politicians, and even part of the clergy. Obviously, another part of society and of the privilege refuse the ideas, because somehow these ideas question their privileges. So these, like the Sociedades Económicas de Amigos del País, yes, so these like associations appeared across the country trying to promote innovations in the different territories, yeah, and somehow became the centers of debates related with these ideas. Like new schools and then like the Royal Academies were founded. As I mentioned before, la Academia de la Lengua, la Academia de la Historia, of medicine, arts, and for example, the Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid was founded too. It was also a very golden era of literature that questioned the backwardness of Spain and the need of Spain to introduce changes. And some of these writers and intellectuals ended up becoming politicians, mainly under, like during the reigns of Charles III and Charles IV, that tried to introduce those changes and transform them into political programs of action.